Hey, welcome back to the Gen Psych lecture series. Today, you are experiencing the very first attempt of mine to give this specific lecture. I've not done a lecture on emotional development before, so bear with me a little bit. I'll probably do some editing to this, but I don't plan on doing a huge amount of that, so there might be some moments left in that are a little imperfect, and I hope that you'll be forgiving if that's the case. So I want to kick this off by thinking about how important emotions are to our development. Our interactions with the adults in our lives when we are still infants is a really major factor in shaping who we eventually become. And you see that, in my opinion, very clearly in a phenomenon presented by the still face paradigm. So this is a research paradigm used to examine the effects of disrupting face-to-face interaction for babies. So you'll see how this is presented in the video itself.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So children's experiences of emotions are hugely important for our ability to interact with each other, our ability to communicate, and it's an enormous part of all human development. And so today I want to dig into a couple of the specifics, the things that we know through psychological research about emotional development. So the first learning outcome today is that by the end of the video you'll be able to more or less basically describe the 4 major theoretical approaches to early social development. We'll go through them reasonably quickly. You'll be able to explain the importance of crying and the display of babies' emotions. We've already talked about how it's very important for communication and for exchange of ideas and concepts, but we'll get more into those ideas. And you'll be able to describe the major attachment styles, and we'll start to work on how they develop. There's a typo here. It says being should we begin to understand how they develop. Extra thanks to Dr. Emanuela Young, pictured here, who made most of the slides you're going to see today. Enjoy the extra U's and all the behaviors. I tried to catch some of them, but then I kind of gave up because there's so many. But these slides have a little Canadian flair to them. Essentially, we're going to work out Dr. Young's answers to what are the emotional lives of young infants like, and how do infants develop relationships with their caregivers, and further from that, how do those early relationships influence their later social and emotional development. So starting from the most basic thing we can say, humans are a social species. This has probably never been made more clear than by the really intense experiences people have had in quarantining from the novel coronavirus in early and now mid and eventually late 2020. The process of experiencing each other's emotions and navigating social interactions is a huge part of who we are as people. But it's not an easy task. Understanding social interactions is very complicated. They're dynamic, they change moment to moment, they're extremely complex. And so this is both part of the reason they're so interesting, but also makes them really, really hard to study scientifically. It's hard to isolate individual variables to really specifically study social interactions. In particular, it's important to keep in mind that these interactions that we're having with each other are typically transactional in nature. They involve some kind of reciprocation. A baby reacts to what the mother's doing, yes, but the baby also influences the mother's behavior, as we just saw in the video, when the mother's acting normally. And so we are both reacting to and producing our environment in any moment. So these interactions are always reciprocal in nature. And the process of starting to figure out this really complicated set of rules and norms surrounding these social interactions during the first 2 years of a baby's life is really, really fascinating. And it turns out to be that it's one of the sort of one of the most noticeable things to me about the early part of that process is that the child's social world starts really, really small, and that seems to be sort of crucial for their ability to build it. And this is certainly true in most Western cultures, and it is, again, that the first social circle that a child has is extremely small. It is their parents and their siblings. And that makes it distinct from pretty much every other phase of a human's social life. There are other ways that early social development is distinct from the rest of a person's entire social life, including that the impact of these relationships is massively powerful. They are really, really long-lasting, and so children seem to develop those strong emotional relationships faster and more intensely when they're infants. We usually see that infants are also kind of predisposed to form them. They start out, that is to say, directly out of the womb communicating about their emotions and trying to establish social bonds, whether they really know it or not. Behaviors like crying and smiling, which starts very soon after birth, are really important tools that enable the infant to have those early social communications. And it seems like part of the reason these early social interactions are so distinct is that the processes governing them are different from those that operate later in life. So again, something fundamental about the way the mind works changes as we age out of infancy and into toddlerhood and then into young adulthood. So the researchers from the four major theoretical approaches have thought about this sort of basic set of questions in a couple of very different ways. And of course, because of their different starting theories, they've pursued different questions. So let's get into these four different approaches. The first is an evolutionary or biological approach. Now, the theorists here argue that social behaviors displayed today reflect a long process of adaptation to the environment. So whatever today is for this individual, this person, it is only a result of a long process that person has gone through, in which they've taken stock of the environment around them and they have adapted their behavior to that environment. This is necessary partially because, especially if you think about the young of many other species, humans are pretty helpless at birth. We can't survive on our own for years after we're born, and we produce relatively few offspring. So if our young did not survive all that long, we wouldn't survive as a species in general. So for this reason, infants are sort of born with a system of behaviors to ensure their survival, according to the evolutionary or biological approach. So that's why they start by smiling and vocalizing and making eye contact in order to sort of promote those caregiving instincts from their parents. This is especially true in the case of the relationship between the infant and the primary caregiver, usually the mother. The infants are they appear to be programmed to behave in ways that keep their mother close to ensure their survival. Like the reason babies are cute to us is so that we care about them. The reason they look straight at their mothers and make eye contact is so that the mother feels that connection. It's pleasant for the mom to interact, and so that's what leads to this intense connection. And interestingly, based on lots and lots of data showing visual looking preferences, infants and children prefer to look at faces with adult features, and adolescents and adults prefer to look at baby-like features. So we all sort of seem to be programmed to look at the other in order to either receive care or give care based on our general age. Pretty interesting. We'll talk in a bit about attachment theory, which actually stems from this perspective, but a second approach to understanding emotional development is an environmental or learning-based approach. These theorists don't necessarily deny those built-in, almost genetic kind of instinctual responses between infants and mothers, but the primary emphasis of these approaches is the general process of capital S socialization. So during this process, an infant's behavior and their expectations and eventually their beliefs are shaped to fit into the social roles, the expectations present in their society or in their culture through social learning and then in addition to that, general conditioning mechanisms. So the same kinds of learning that we talked about in the learning chapter are present in this theory. This is based on those same principles. So during that kind of learning process, infants and mothers produce behaviors that are either positively or negatively reinforcing on each other, so either rewards or punishments, and that result is a learned pattern, and that pattern results in some kind of attachment. So rather than saying that the early behaviors of the infant are completely innate, a learning theorist would say that they are learned and reinforced. So the baby smiles at mom reacts positively to that, the baby goes, I should keep smiling. Not in so many words, but they learn that process through the operant conditioning principles that are present. And the same in the reverse direction. Third type of theorists are the cognitive-developmental theorists, who believe primarily that social behaviors are influenced by cognitive abilities. So the question they seek to answer is what cognitive processes underlie the social behaviors that we see. So for example, if children are trying to predict another person's behavior by trying to figure out what that person is thinking, what they believe to be true, the child can't do that until they're able to understand that another person might be thinking something other than what they're thinking. So they have to develop theory of mind before they can fully predict other people's behavior. And so the process toward making it there and making accurate predictions about other people is thought to begin in infancy. And this process is called social cognition. So babies' abilities to follow other babies or other people's gaze is sort of the first step in this process of building social cognition. In terms of how this relates to attachment, both infants and mothers are typically believed to kind of have a cognitive idea and a representation of their relationship in which they develop these sorts of statistical, obviously unconscious statistical models about how they have interacted in the past and how they might interact in the future, that they then use to form expectations and sort of understandings about how the world works around them and how each other works in their typical interactions. So like in this case, an infant might develop an expectation of a mother's behavior as a result of some of the treatment that she provides. So if the baby signals distress by crying or screaming and the mother responds quickly and reliably, the baby might develop the expectation that mom's available if needed, and so might be less likely to cry when left alone. On the other hand, caregivers might develop some kind of internal working model as well that could lead them to expect that the infant would want to interact with them. Baby likes me. Those kinds of expectations. So these are those internal working models. The fourth type is the sociocultural approach. So these theorists see infant survival as contingent on nurture rather than nature, and protection from caregivers being sort of the utmost importance. And they note that primarily that cultures vary in the behaviors they prescribe to meet those different survival needs. So this really takes into account a lot of the cultural differences throughout the world in child rearing. So they differ from the kind of environmental theorists in terms of the scope of their focus. They're thinking maybe a little bit more widely about the context of the interactions between mothers and babies. And so there's some sort of very well-known theorists in here, including Bronfenbrenner, who wrote the model that really kind of defined the sociocultural approach early on. Basically, he wrote that you first must situate the interactions of individuals in their different settings. So you have to think about the context of every interaction, because there's plenty of data that has shown that the conditions outside the caregiver-infant dyad can influence the quality of that relationship. So like the relationship between mother and child can be influenced very, very heavily by the other child care that child receives, their other options. So whether they seek child care from some other related caregiver like a grandmother, or they seek daycare and they have either a good or bad experience there, and so on and so on. You can get even more sort of objective sounding and sciencey about this if you look at Super and Harkness's developmental niche model. We'll stop there for the purposes of Gen Psych, though, and move on to our next big question for this video, which is what early social emotional behavior is like. What do babies do? What can they do? We've already talked about the fact that mothers and infants do engage in a lot of interaction early on, and in fact they tend to mutually regulate each other. So they have a close emotional attachment based on the success of that communication. So infants have to do it. They have to find some way to communicate their emotions or communicate how they're feeling before they can say them, before they acquire language. So we talked a little bit in the cognitive development video about how babbling can kind of communicate a little bit, and babies also communicate through gestures. We saw the one point in the video. They do a lot of other sort of the intensity of their physical movements communicates a lot. But even before that, infants have another way to convey their wants, and it is crying. Crying is the most important form of infant communication. It is, first of all, a stimulus for the mother. It is capable of eliciting caregiving, but it's also a behavior that the infant can modify in response to the consequences of different types of cries. So for crying to be a communication, it has to vary. And the people listening to the crying have to be able to recognize those variations and know what each of them mean. And this is what happens. Babies have different types of cries that they use to communicate different messages, and their caregivers eventually become pretty skilled at recognizing the differences in those cries and in those communications. For example, as the pitch increases, so as it gets higher in pitch, adults typically start to perceive the baby's problem as becoming more serious and more urgent. And this is it's a natural thing. You don't have to think about this when you're an adult giving care for a baby. Pain cries and hunger cries differ in pitch and intensity. The ability of an adult to interpret these cries is pretty heavily based on experience. Parents who've spent lots of time around infants are better at understanding infant cries than other adults who have little experience. So once you have a baby, it becomes a little easier to figure out the cries of other babies. And that experience allows parents to also read the contextual cues. You sort of figure out something based on the infant's facial expressions, and you sort of take advantage that way of both the instinctual nature and then the environment-based nurture effects of crying. It's at first innately kind of elicited by things like hunger and pain, and then it eventually turns into a more environmental-based reaction or piece of communication where babies use crying to communicate whatever they need in the moment. The research on crying suggests that most of the early messages sent by babies involve things that make them upset, things that are dislikes. But newborns also can communicate positive emotions. They can communicate what they like using behaviors like smiling or just sort of happier vocalizing or looking, gazing at an object that they find interesting. And those are the kind of initial internal reactions or feelings that we start to call emotions. The baby's preferences for some things, and their aversion to other things. And the psychological term for that is affect. We call the general outward expression of emotions through facial expressions or gestures affect in babies and adults. So whenever you hear that's, it's a confusing addition to your lexicon, I know. So there is, first of all, the word effect, which is the noun version of when you're looking for an effect. There is affect, which is the verb version of the word effect, so when something affects something else. And then there is affect, which has this maybe slightly stronger emphasis on that first syllable and is the psychology word for outward expressions of emotion. So if you ever see affect used especially as a noun with an A at the beginning of the word, that means we're talking about emotions, not effects. Confusing. Anyway, early on, there is a really close correspondence between feelings and expression in babies. They feel a thing, they express it immediately. They don't really start to learn to hold any of that back until much, much later in development. But that ability to display and the immediate display is necessary because it is the foundation of mutual regulation and eventually trust between the baby and the caregiver, the mother, in most cases. So there's a lot of research on infant emotion and infant facial expression. We know that after 6 weeks, babies are capable of scanning other faces and that they can detect the differences between a smiling face and a frowning face. We know this from the looking paradigms we've talked about in the other video. And then by around 5 or 6 months, infants start to imitate smiles, and that starts to fill in the rest of their knowledge about social references and displays of emotion. Social referencing, by the way, is using information about other people's emotional expressions to regulate behavior. So if everyone's happy around you, you realize that everything is safe and you can also be happy. Whereas if everyone is upset, you can read the bad vibes, you can kind of feel that negativity, and it might make you feel more negative. So around 6 months is when that starts to actively happen based on facial expressions. In terms of their actual production of facial expressions, they tend to appear at different points. Babies gain different emotional expressions at different times. They of course start off by staring and crying, and then about 10 to 12 weeks after birth, you start to see smiles. Depending on the baby, you start to see anger at something like 3 to 4 months. And then more complicated emotional states like fear around 8 months, and more complicated ones, combinations later on. In the middle of the second year of life, infants start to become more aware of themselves. They recognize pictures of themselves. My niece does a fun thing where she even recognizes herself as a baby, but she kind of just identifies all babies as her. I'm not sure that she totally... But if you say, who's this a picture of? She'll go, baby Emmy. She's usually right, because we're not showing her pictures of other babies very often. If you go, no, this is a different baby, she goes, oh, okay. But she knows herself, for sure. And she did right around this time. But this recognition of their own reflection and of pictures of themselves is reflective of a sort of ability to create more complex emotions, things like empathy that might start to appear around the second year. Empathy, if you're not familiar, is the ability to sort of experience another person's emotional state, to imagine their reaction or sort of put yourself in their emotional shoes, so to speak. And you can start seeing rudimentary signs of empathy pretty early in infancy, but we don't really see full development of empathy around the second year, until around the second year of life. We also see things like jealousy start to develop in the second year, and then other kinds of self-evaluative emotions like shame or guilt start to develop around that period between 2 and 3 years as well. And the emergence of these emotions, how early they do and how strong they are, is guided somewhat by biological processes. It seems to be pretty universal across cultures. But even in early infancy, some aspects of that development can be shaped by the culture around the infant. So in cultures where infants are pretty much always in constant physical contact with caregivers, they don't express as much emotion because there's not as much need, because they can express what they need or want or how they're feeling physically. For example, among the Inuit people up in the Arctic of Quebec, infants are pretty much always in a pouch inside their mother's parka, and so under those circumstances, the infant's sort of small physical changes in their posture or small movements are enough to communicate with their caregivers. So people who visit these kinds of communities will walk in and say, wow, those infants, your babies are so well behaved, they barely ever cry. And the reason is because they're constantly held. They don't need to as much. Another way that babies learn emotions in a sort of socialized way is through their experience of other people's displaying emotions. Most mothers only display a few facial expressions to their babies, mostly positive ones, and so the babies in turn tend to match them. I already mentioned that children over time learn to control their affective displays. They learn to not display all their emotions at all times, which sounds sort of bad, but it is adaptive and necessary. We mask our feelings to avoid negative outcomes, to protect our self-esteem, to fit with norms or conventions in our culture, or potentially out of concern for somebody else's feelings or somebody else's well-being. You don't pump your fist when you win something if the person you beat is right next to you, or maybe you do, but if we're masking, that can be one of the reasons. And that's sort of increased socialization. It shows that children are becoming aware of the rules around emotional display, the expectations about the expression of their affect. We'll talk more about attitudes and expectations in the social psych section coming up in a little while. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and just deal with one question in a shorter way. We'll talk a lot about personality coming up in a few more videos. And there's some evidence suggesting that babies might also have some of the building blocks of personality, and that building block is referred to as temperament. So the studies of personality in infants are pretty much restricted to examinations of temperament because they don't display enough complicated emotions and reactions and have the language to fill out a full definitional personality. Which isn't supposed to be an insult to babies. Babies typically just have temperament. It's their behavioral style, it's their emotional expressiveness, their responsiveness to stimulation, and some of the things that make each baby unique. And so we sort of colloquially call it personality, but in psychological terminology, it's usually referred to as temperament. The definitions then of temperament don't really talk about what necessarily babies do, but kind of how they do it. And it tends to focus on heritability and stability across time. So, for example, you might see two babies on a swing, and one might really love it, shrieking and laughing, and the other might be calm in a swing and even fall asleep. They can have different reactions to the same stimuli. I talked about it being genetic, and in fact, twin studies suggest a very strong genetic influence on temperament. Twins tend to have very similar temperaments, and if you test twins separately, they tend to show the same emotional responses to the same stimuli. The aspects of temperament appear to be relatively stable across time as well, particularly the negative, quote-unquote, negative aspects. You can only really measure some among newborns. Things like irritability and other forms of negative responding are usually there right at the beginning, but most of these develop, again, more over time, over the first year or so of life. And so there are a number of theories that attempt to kind of conceptualize temperament. I'm going to show you one. There are others in this slide deck if you have access to it that you can look at if you're interested. But I'll just present you this research-based approach to temperament that was established by a big study called the New York Longitudinal Study, which lasted 40 years, at the end of which the authors, Thomas and Chess, tried to identify early correlates of personality and eventual psychological health. So they based this early data on parent reports. They did interviews. And they asked about all kinds of things like how active the child was, how adaptable the child was, how intense their emotional responses are. And through all those data, they developed 3 different patterns of behavior that they saw. So they identified some as easy babies, about 40%, babies that easily adapted to the environment around them. So they had predictable schedules, they were sort of rhythmic in their reactions and in their actions, and they were generally sort of happy, positive in mood. Difficult babies are the opposite of easy babies, as you might have guessed. About 10% of infants have unpredictable schedules, cry frequently, and have intense reactions. And then about 15% of the babies studied adapt fairly poorly to new situations and aren't particularly active or intense, and they call those slow to warm up babies. Now you might be noticing that we've not reached 100 yet. There are 35% of babies in the sample that don't fit any of these 3 types. So there probably are more than 3 types, and it's just that they didn't quite have enough data, surprisingly, after 40 years of collection, to identify all of them, or it could be that enough babies are unique and singular that it's not going to be possible to come up with more categories. These descriptors are somewhat useful, but are apparently a little challenged, I should say, in that they depend heavily on parent reports. And so parents probably don't report their baby's activities or their baby's actions and intensities perfectly accurately for a number of possible reasons. They might have self-serving biases, they might have really good or really bad observational skills, or they might just not remember. So there's some issues in this study that have been solved by methodology and some that still persist. But an important overarching dimension identified by all of these is the goodness of fit between the baby's response style and their surroundings. And so the effect of temperament on the surroundings and the effect of the surroundings on temperament is, again, reciprocal. And that's probably the most important takeaway from the work by Thomas and Chess. If you wanted to think about this a little more, you could think about how you might characterize your temperament. Are you a good baby? Are you an easy baby, a difficult baby, or are you slow to warm up? Or would you say you don't fit in any of those categories? Even now, is it stable? Or do you have the same basic temperament that you did since you were a kid? Have you changed? How so? So let's finish up by talking about attachment as our last topic here. We know that infants, again, form deep emotional bonds with their caregivers. We've talked about this at length now, and so we need to think about how we characterize those bonds. We primarily do so through a concept called attachment. This is the central issue for social development during infancy. It is the formation of the intense emotional relationship between mother and child. That's the definition of attachment. So both the affective system, the emotion system, and the temperament of the infant are really important for the attachment process. That's why we discussed both of those before we got here. Attachment begins pretty soon after birth and is clearly observable at least 6 months of age, and it typically occurs in 4 phases. So in the first initial phase, infants start to use their built-in responses to elicit and sustain close contact with others. So that's their initial crying responses mainly, and crying and staring. So while the baby's sociability, its interest in others, doesn't tend to be confined to the mother very rapidly develops an intense maternal bond with the infant. Potentially, that might happen in a really sensitive period immediately after birth, where we don't really have really good data coming to a conclusion about that yet. But then after the first 12 weeks or so 8 to 12 weeks, infants start to be a little more discriminating in their social responsiveness. They tend to focus their attention onto their mother, and they direct their social interactions to her, or whoever their primary caregiver is, fairly singularly. And that's when they start to develop their unique communication system. That's when they start to distinguish their cries and all that kind of good stuff. Then in phase 3, between 8 and 24-ish months, we start to see focused attachment, in which you see babies reacting negatively to unfamiliar people and places, and attempts to maintain closeness to their primary caregiver. So if they feel separated, they protest, typically by crying and by searching for the mother or the caregiver. We don't really start to see full-blown attachment until infants come to use the mother as a secure base, and that's typically around this time. So they'll alter their physical proximity to her to regulate other feelings of fear and insecurity. So if they feel any of those ways, they'll seek out their primary caregiver, usually their mother. In the fourth phase, from 3 years old and on, we call goal-corrected partnerships. Children understand that their caregivers are separate people from themselves. They start to develop that kind of theory of mind. Separation protest starts to decline, and children start to engage in more reciprocal, back and forth relationships with their caregivers that develop as they continue to get older into more and more reciprocal nature. The primary well-known researcher here is Ainsworth, who identified 3 patterns of attachment. So the first is securely attached infants. These are the ones who explore the environment freely and are distressed at separation but enthusiastically reunite with their mother. That's about 65% of infants. The second type is an insecure avoidant infant who shows little distress at separation and then can sometimes avoid the caregiver when they're reunited. Insecure resistant infants are distressed throughout the procedure. They show relief and anger at reunion with the mother, so after being separated and reunited. And then researchers have actually identified a fourth attachment pattern after Ainsworth. They call it insecure, disorganized, or disoriented. This is an infant that displays an unpredictable and distressed response throughout separation, which is associated with sort of frightened or withdrawn behaviors on the part of the mother and persists over time. There's more information about these in the slides, so if you have access again, there is some information on how to assess attachment styles and some videos of the styles specifically. So with the types identified, the next big question is how are they shaped? How does an infant gain one or the other type of attachment? So there are 3 main variables that appear to be associated with attachment patterns. The first is the kind of care the child receives from their caregiver. So you might also hear this referred to as maternal responsiveness. The next is adults' memories and experiences of their own childhood attachment. And then the third is the temperament of the infant. So mothers who are sensitive to their infant's needs, who adjust their behavior to the behavior of the child, have securely attached infants. So if they are able to adapt to the child's pace of feeding, if they are responsive to crying, if they're really well synchronized in face-to-face interactions, they tend to have securely attached infants. Attachment matters in the grander scale because, very simply, having a secure attachment style as an infant is correlated with a number of positive cognitive and social characteristics, potentially throughout the lifespan. You of course want to keep contextual factors in mind. It could be the case that, and is often the case, that attachment style is not the only predictor here. But securely attached infants grow up to be better problem solvers. They grow up to be more curious adults. They are more exploratory in nature. They're more attentive in school. They earn higher grades. They're more socially competent, and they're less likely to manifest emotional problems than infants in any other attachment category. So early social emotional development is really, really complicated. There is a lot of complexity in the interactions themselves, which tend to be generally transactional, and this development is affected by social factors, biological and evolutionary factors, cognitive factors, development in the brain, and environmental surrounding contextual factors, which continue to influence development through year 2 and 3, and then in other domains throughout the rest of our lives. So this is a really important, really interesting area of psychology that I'm glad I finally have the content to share with you. So This is a long, long video. Probably need to look into cutting it into some pieces later on. But for now, hope you enjoyed. See you next time.